So in this case reading video, we're going to look at our first specific performance case, which is the case of Dugan and Lay, which is a 1946 case involving a taxicab and a taxicab license. So this case primarily concerns the concept of adequacy of damages, which is one of those threshold principles or requirements that needs to be met for specific performance to be available. And by requirements that needs to be met, what I mean is specific performance is only available when damages are inadequate. Okay. The case also deals with the concept of mutuality and supervision in some minor detail as well. All right, so here Dugan entered into a contract with Lay for the sale of a taxi cab, so for a physical car, a cab, and as well as the taxi license that went with the cab. At the time, obtaining a license for a taxi was quite difficult. And I noticed in the facts it said, I think it was, there's for every 6 people wanting to buy a license, there was only 1 license. So the supply of licenses was very, very low compared to demand. In any case, so they entered into this contract, which was for just shy of £2,000. Dugan then decided that he didn't want to go through with the contract, so he changed his mind and he refused to sell the cab and transfer the license. Here, the plaintiff, Lay, tried to seek specific performance of the contract, so they wanted that license, as opposed to damages. And the defendant, Dugan, argued that damages here were adequate, and that in any case, there was no mutuality. And what they mean by that is they were unable themselves to enforce specific performance of the contract, therefore it shouldn't be enforced against them. Here, the order for specific performance was granted. So on the adequacy of damages issue, the court held that while chattels, so while goods, are not usually the subject of specific performance orders, that is, damages are usually adequate for chattels. The reason being is that chattels, you normally have more than one. For example, if it's buying shares, I don't know, in a company, the physical shares held by a particular person are not themselves seen to be special or unique. You can always buy from someone else. So the usual rule is that chattels are not especially peculiar or unique, and therefore specific performance won't be granted. But here it was held that because the car itself was a taxi, so it was specifically built for a particular purpose, and on top of that, the license was quite unique and quite rare, particularly given the demand far exceeding the supply. Because of those reasons, it was held that damages, common law damages, would be inadequate here. So the license was specifically special or having or holding that unique value, and therefore specific performance was available. Okay, and we'll go through the reasons for this in just a little bit more detail now. All right, so in terms of our case reading questions, the first question just starts off very generally. So what is an order for specific performance? So an order for specific performance is essentially just a court order that compels the defaulting party to complete the contract. So rather than you just claiming your losses against that party, you're actually seeking to get them to perform their obligations, which in this instance was getting them to sell the car and transfer the license. The next question, so Lay and Nash sued for a breach of contract to sell the taxi cabin license. They were later successful in obtaining another taxi cabin license. Yeah, so after Dugan here refused to complete the contract, they actually were able to buy a taxi cabin license from someone else for, I think, £1,900. So they got lucky, but that was seen to be irrelevant here. Okay, so the chattel was still of unique or special value, even though they were able to buy another. Okay, so here, what can you infer about the amount of damages they would have recovered for breach if they claimed damages instead of specific performance? Okay, so what that's focusing on here is under common law damages, you have a duty to mitigate your losses. So here they had a duty, I guess, to seek to try and replace the good that they were unable to obtain through the contract. So they had a duty to try and stop their losses from failure to hold the license by seeking another license. And here, because they were able to obtain another license, duty to mitigate meant that their losses stopped running at that point in time. Okay, so they would have only then been entitled to the difference in price, which was only £50, because they obtained that second car and license. And so their losses under the common law were actually, basically negligible, which is why the defendant was here arguing that common law damages would be adequate, because they wanted that purchase of the later license to be taken into account. Here, the reason why you'd only be able to obtain the £50 if it had been proceeded under common law damages claim is because of the potential for overcompensation, because remembering that the purpose of the compensation principle under common law is for breach of contract is to put the party in a position they would have been in had the contract been performed. So if they'd been able to obtain further losses, they would have ended up being overcompensated. Now, moving on to the next question. So Dugan raised two grounds against the granting of an order for specific performance. What were they? The first was that damages were an adequate remedy because they only wanted to pay that £50 figure rather than hand over the taxi cabin license. And the second ground of defence that they raised was that they could not have sued the respondents for specific performance at the date of the contract, so it was wanting in mutuality. So if you remember back to our PowerPoint overview, I mentioned on one of those early slides in that PowerPoint the principle of mutuality. Usually you can only get, or technically, or you're supposed to traditionally, you're only able to get specific performance if a specific performance order could be obtained against you. However, I noted on that slide that this is a pretty ambiguous or not particularly effective ground for potentially refusing a specific performance order. Here it was argued because the transfer of the license had to be approved by the commissioner, therefore there was no mutuality here because it wasn't within the party's control for the contract to be specifically performed. But was between a moment, that argument was rejected by the court. All right, I'll just move on so we can see how that mutuality argument played out. Okay, so what reason did the court give for the rule that specific performance is not ordinarily available to enforce a contract for the sale of goods, chattels? So going back to the goods argument, you can see that dealt with at 153, and that's quite straightforward. Essentially, equity will not order a decree of specific performance of a contract where damages afford an adequate remedy for the breach. So this is the position in most cases of personal property, so most cases of chattels, such as any goods which can be readily purchased on the market. And the reason is these goods are not particularly special. You can obtain another. So just get your damages, be compensated for your loss, and then go out and buy a new chattel. Okay, is essentially the idea of the court. Now, does this rule apply to all contracts for the sale of goods? No, it doesn't. So what kinds of goods attract an order for specific performance? So there's essentially an exception for goods which are unique or for some other reason have a special or peculiar value. So just say a family, I don't know, some type of antique or heirloom, but just say, something that's more of a one-of-a-kind good, or like in this instance, something that is quite difficult to obtain, like this taxi license. And why was this case distinguishable? So you can see Chief Justice Dixon's comments around that, around the 150 point in the case. The contract is, in fact, for the transfer of a valuable privilege attached to a chattel. So they're really focused on the license here. So it's not just a car, it's a license that went with the car. So, and Chief Justice Dixon says that of the amount of consideration, the greater part represented the registration and the license, and the lesser part the vehicle. So it's less about the vehicle, more about the license, the value of the contract. So the subject of the sale was thus a special right attached to a chattel, transferable only with it and numerically restricted because there weren't that many of those licenses. So why didn't it matter then that Leigh and Nash had managed to purchase another taxi cabin license? You can see this in Justice Williams' judgment, where it stated that it's immaterial that the respondents managed to purchase another taxi cab. At 154, you can see that the statement that if personal property is of such a nature that it can be the subject of specific performance, the purchase of similar property could no more affect the rights of the purchaser than the purchase of a block of land adjoining the block purchase could affect the right of the purchaser to the previous contract. So essentially it's irrelevant. So you just got to focus on the good that was the subject of the contract here and look to see whether it's special or unique. Now we look at the mutuality argument now at 5. So what particular aspect of the contract was the argument about lack of mutuality based on? So the relevant legislation specifically or expressly authorised the appellant to sell and transfer the taxi cab and licence to an applicant who satisfied the commissioner that they were a fit and proper person. So there was that statutory requirements there around registration. So the appellant could not have compelled the purchaser to complete as they may not have obtained consent. Okay, so that's why they argued that there was no mutuality here. What constraint on the court's willingness to grant specific performance is alluded to by the court as underpinning this argument. This came down to the requirement of supervision. So the idea that the court doesn't want to have the parties come back, essentially, and continually have to monitor whether a contract is being, I guess, carried out. But they rejected this argument or this requirement of supervision in this case because they said that where the steps which are required to obtain consent are defined and capable of supervision. So they said it was quite straightforward here what had to happen in terms of the documents being put forward and then the commissioner considering them. So because those steps were defined and capable of supervision, they said it was well within the competence of the court of equity to compel the parties to take the steps. And in the present case, the respondents must place before the commissioner the evidence as may reasonably be required. So it wasn't a problem here that there was an administrative process that had to happen before the license could be transferred because the steps that the party had to take were quite straightforward and capable of definition. In terms of the order, so how was it to be framed? You can see Justice Rich at 148. So the respondents are required to join with the appellant in the application to the commissioner and to sign documents for obtaining the transfer of registration. Straightforward process, yeah. The court was not required to look over or supervise a series of acts, and the order in question does not purport to control the commissioner's discretion. So the court, wasn't convinced essentially by the mutuality and lack of supervision or requirement of constant supervision argument. If the Transport Commissioner had decided that Leigh and Nash were not fit and proper persons, then what would have happened? Well, in the event of refusal, the obligation would simply have been at an end, which was why the court didn't see it as particularly problematic. All right, so Dugan and Leigh, a little bit on the concept of mutuality, but the more important point to take away from this case is around that idea of specific performance not tending to be ordered in cases of personal property or chattels unless they have that special or unique characteristics. All right, because in that case, damages won't be seen to be adequate.